But not only are we hearing that he was grading women differently, but also that he was rude to women and that he, quote, had a sexist attitude.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. According to Ashley Banfield, Kobberger was being investigated by Washington State University for his role as a teaching assistant when the crime happened. Now, I have been trying to get hold of the document that she's been referring to, and it's not available anywhere, and that is always a problem. She does refer to sources, and I do regard Banfield and News Nation as credible, but it is a bit problematic that we do not see this document. It has been referenced with a timeline, and that does seem to give it some veneer, certainly of credibility, but it would really be good to see the document ourselves. If we accept it, and I think probably we should, because we know about bad Teachergate, we know what Hayden Stinchfield said, this only deepens our sense of Kohberger's social death. We realize just how extreme it is, and we also realize how extreme he was, how unpleasant he seems to be as a person, how prickly he seems to be as a person. And so we see not only was he facing social humiliation from his peers and, just ordinary people didn't seem to be particularly interested in him, in a student union situation. People who didn't know him were turned off by him. People who did know him were turned off by him, but he was also facing a kind of professional repudiation. And it wasn't just a one-off thing. He had two altercations. One wonders what that is. Is that a shouting match with one of his professors? I think it's a guy called Professor Snyder. So I do think if he graded too strictly and then he gave everyone high marks and then paid no attention to the assignments, then that's also a serious issue. You kind of get the idea that he's got a serious attitude problem, a serious chip on his shoulder. So one really senses that Brian was unraveling on all fronts. He was basically a loser in every dimension of his life. It must have felt like the whole world was against him, and also he wanted some payback for what felt to him like it was unfair bullying. And how did he respond in the past to being bullied? It's a serious question. How did Brian respond in the past to being bullied? Well, he bullied right back. And you kind of get the sense that he feels bullied. I don't think it's very realistic, but you kind of get the sense that he perceives it as being bullied by perhaps his lecturers, and so he's antagonistic in response because he's smarter than everyone in the room, right? According to Banfield, Kobberger was warned several times by his professors, and he responded by becoming increasingly feisty and belligerent. So in other words, he responds by, I guess, being cheeky and by being cocky and by coming across quite aggressive. I think it's one thing to be a star student online, and bear in mind that whole online tutoring and online studies. And so perhaps he lost some of his social graces during that period. It's another thing to be in Washington, realizing things are done different here, but then digging in his heels and then deciding, when in Rome, continue to be a Gaul and continue to be galling. We also have a rumor that bad Teachergate, the intervention where Kobberger was forced into a face-off with 75 students, actually 150, but 75 who were very much opposed to him. We've got confirmation now that that happened 4 weeks prior to the murders. That happened in October. And if you think about Nutgate in the Watts case, which happened on July 9th, that happened 5 weeks before the murders. And it's very hard to think that something like this, bad Teachergate, happening 4 weeks, that wasn't central to putting him on a conveyor into the incident as it happened. In other words, if there was some criminal psychology in place, it accelerated, it really drove home some impulses that were there to begin with. You kind of have a sense that he had nothing to lose, that his goose was cooked anyway, and that he wanted some payback, don't you? One also has the impression, because he's had these altercations with a professor, that the faculty wanted to put Brian into a situation to teach him a lesson, to perhaps teach him some humility, and because they didn't like him either. And according to his termination letter, Brian had a sexist attitude towards females he interacted with, and that he also graded female students differently to men. One wonders whether he had some sort of cynical plan with regard to that, whether the idea was to grade them poorly, then they come to him wanting wanting some kind of explanation, and that then leads to an interaction, and perhaps he thought he could use that to sort of broker some sort of sexual favor. Maybe that is his sort of attitude, and his maybe he had kind of a strategic approach to being in the university setting in that sense. So you sort of got the feeling when Kobberger arrived in Washington, as I say, with a huge chip on his shoulder, he sullied his relationships with literally everyone around him. And then he went over to the University of Idaho and did the same thing there as well. By November, he was so embittered and arrogant that he felt he had a bone to pick with literally everyone. And then that is what this crime seems to be, is Brian picking a bone with everyone. He wanted to cut through the fabric, the sort of warm and fuzzy fabric. He wanted to cut through that and teach them a lesson and prove how smart he was in his own little sort of game. And so he settled on the funhouse as a proxy for getting everyone back. Doesn't it seem that way? What happened to Brian was personal. It was personal, but it wasn't personal in terms of the victims. And in that sense, it was a symbolic crime. It's hard for me to imagine all of this couldn't have happened without a behind-the-scenes drug addiction. The strange behavior within the class setting at Washington State University, it's hard to believe that that's not taking place without some kind of drug aspect. Kohberger comes across not as merely delusional, but deceitful. But also, you get the idea that no one was more deceived about himself and his place in the world than Brian. And no one gets to that level of out-of-your-skull fucked upness than on drugs. No one gets to that level of being sort of whacked out and just totally out of line, out of sync, than if you're on drugs. And as Brian's downward spiral continued, as it worsened, he likely became an increasingly heavy user, and the temptation for payback likely escalated in leaps and bounds, especially those long hours where he was awake by himself. What was he doing? What was he thinking? Brian's behavior, allegedly within the crime scene, and I've said this before, isn't that of a cool, calculated criminal genius, but an idiot high on his own hubris, in my opinion. I think justice in this case is Kohberger finding himself dependent on a female lawyer for his defense. He's got all of these prejudices against females, and now his life is literally hanging on a female. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.